at the level of economics, we know more or less what should be done. But the key question is how to introduce what we know it would work. This is the question of political economists. I would congratulate the organizer for picking up this theme. Why we are speaking about market reforms? Because in most countries there were collectivist reforms before, including the Western countries. And interesting to know why, because there may be some lessons with respect to what are the sources of resistance and what are the danger of a revival of statism after the period of liberal reforms. At the general level, one can point out, I think, to three forces which determine the probability of market reforms. First, as mentioned, initial conditions, including how bad or good is the initial economic situation. Second, interests, including what I call collectivist interest, groups of people who, in their own individual benefit, press for maintaining or introducing collectivist solutions, being entrepreneurs who dislike competition or politicians who like power. And third, collectivist cliches or myth or beliefs, they refer to the role of the state in the society. And as Professor Olesina has pointed out in his research, one cannot explain differences among at least Western European countries by omitting this variable. Now, the strengths of these three forces, or two forces, interest versus ideological beliefs, can differ across reforms. And I think there's an interesting empirical issue to try to determine what is the relative strengths of this sort of barriers. My guess would be that as far as the product market, the regulation is concerned, there's relatively little resistance among interests except for protectionism, much economic resistance, little ideological beliefs nowadays. But if you take one reform, which was only partly alluded to, reducing the fiscal position of the state, which in practically every Western European country is overextended. 40%, 50% is much too much from the economic point of view, and we also mentioned the scope for civil society. I think there's a big role for collectivist beliefs. There's an ideology of welfarism, and there's a belief that if there was less welfare state, there would be no welfare. So what is being disregarded is the potential for civil society. Look at 19th century friendly societies in Britain, which were crowded out by the expansion of statism in a welfare form. And look at the third world, where the expansion of welfare states destroys the civil society's form of self-help. So I think this is one of the interesting topics to research, where the role of ideological beliefs is very strong, and there are new beliefs. If you look at the beliefs in 19th century, Victorian values, they were completely different. A belief of individual freedom, individual responsibility, and work. And there's interesting story how it changed, and why we have to restore it to some extent, and what was the sequence of destroying it. I think political forces have led to expansion of the welfare state. Then what followed? The change in beliefs via education, via political debates, etc., etc. Now, another point is that usually we know that large, radical, and comprehensive reforms happen under special circumstances. What are these special circumstances? A very serious military threat, like in Japan, major reforms, or liberation from occupation, like in Central and Eastern Europe, or a very serious economic crisis, and you may have all this combined. But I think there's an interesting category of radical reforms which were launched under less special circumstances, and they merit research. In Poland, to use my own country example, between 1998 and 2000, we have accelerated 4 serious reforms of 5. Privatization, pension reform, very serious pension reform, health service reform, and regional government reform, giving more power to regional governments. And there was no crisis before. In Slovakia, there were very radical reformers, starting in 2001. There was no crisis before. There was a threat of crisis, but no crisis. So it's interesting to know why you might have cases of radical and comprehensive reforms without a crisis. And my guess would be you would have to have a special reform team in a position of power. To some extent, it's a chance factor, if you cannot create. But if you happen to have special circumstances, treat it as a gift of history and use it. How? By moving with the reforms very fast. Because special circumstances create what I call the time for extraordinary politics, which would not last forever. It can last for 1 year or two. Be very quick with well-prepared reforms. To be well prepared, you have to prepare yourself, and this is my last point. Now, there's of course no magic formula how to overcome the forces of resistance and introduce reforms. This is to some extent an art, not a science. But at least in a general direction, we can point out what would be useful. And my observation would be build civil society, build forces in the civil society which would prepare the reform blueprints and would try to shift the societies in the direction of reforms. What are these organizations? Think tanks of a proper nature and associations. And they should do two things, as I mentioned. First, to prepare the blueprints for reform, to be ready. It's not enough just to say we need reform. You have to have a detailed blueprint for reform. So whenever a political window of opportunity opens, so that one will be able to move very fast. And second, to try to prepare this window of opportunity by a constant persuasion. And this is a battle of, not only of ideas, this is a battle of mass communication. And if you will, of propaganda. And one has to be better. And to be better, it's not enough to refer to efficiency gains. One has to beat populists in their own game, on the moral ground, and emotions. And then what values should be pointed out if you try to present and persuade people? Work, first, then individual freedom, individual responsibility, and one has not only should have tried to present the values of this sort related to the proposed reforms which would reduce the harmful presence of the state. One should try to unmask the proponents of statism. And just one final example. What is the unemployment in the OECD countries among younger people and women when the average rate of our unemployment is high? And this is Italy, to my knowledge, perhaps I am wrong, sorry, France and Germany. In those countries, the main victims are younger people and women because they feel the burden of the average. Is it moral? It's very immoral. Our extended welfare state is immoral. It's not only inefficient. And this sort of message should be used, based on facts. Thank you.